If Miss Eleanor Hayes is to be seated beneath this family, then I shall be seated beneath them as well. Alexander Whitmore spoke so quietly that Lady Beatrice almost smiled before she understood what he meant. Then the Duke of Blackwood rose from the head of the long mahogany table, and every conversation in the Candlelit dining room died at once. Eleanor sat 12 feet away near the paneled wall, alone at a narrow table ordinarily reserved for secretaries, tutors, and those considered respectable enough to enter Blackwood Hall, but not important enough to belong within its inner circle. She had known the insult was deliberate from the moment Lady Beatrice lifted Eleanor's place card from the family table and carried it across the room with the careful smile of a woman who preferred cruelty dressed as etiquette. "Surely this will be more comfortable for you, Miss Hayes," Beatrice had said. "Family dinners can be rather overwhelming when one is unaccustomed to them." Eleanor had felt the meaning beneath every polished word. She was a bookkeeper's daughter. Her father had died under a cloud of suspicion. Her blue dress had been altered by her own hands instead of ordered from a fashionable dressmaker. Nothing about her belonged among the silver, crystal, and generations of Whitmore portraits staring down from the walls. Yet Eleanor had not argued. She had merely answered, "Thank you, Lady Beatrice," and crossed the room with her shoulders straight. That dignity, more than the insult itself, had caught Alexander's attention. He had returned to Blackwood Hall only 3 days earlier after years spent overseeing family interests in New York, and until that evening Eleanor had known him only as a distant figure with gray eyes, a restrained voice, and a reputation for noticing everything while revealing almost nothing. Now he folded his napkin, lifted his glass, and walked away from the seat of honor beside Lady Margaret. "Alexander," Beatrice said sharply, "that table is not intended for family." He stopped beside Eleanor. "Then perhaps family is not where I wish to sit tonight." Eleanor looked up despite herself. No one had ever defended her with such simplicity. Worse, some fragile part of her wished it did not matter as much as it did. Alexander pulled out the empty chair opposite her and sat. He did not offer sympathy. He did not ask whether she was hurt. He simply began dinner as though her table had become the most natural place in the room. The family slowly resumed speaking, though every voice sounded strained. Eleanor lowered her gaze and reached for her napkin. Her fingers brushed the wooden edge beneath the linen. Something rough interrupted the polished surface. She traced it once, then again. A circle crossed by 3 narrow lines. Her breath stopped. She knew that symbol. Her father had drawn it beside certain entries in his private account books during the final months of his life, always refusing to explain what it meant. Eleanor bent slightly, pretending to adjust the fabric across her lap while examining the carving more carefully. Alexander noticed immediately. "What did you find?" he murmured. Eleanor looked toward Lady Beatrice. Across the room, the older woman's face had suddenly lost all color. Eleanor turned back to Alexander. "This table," she whispered. "It belonged to my father." Alexander did not answer at once. His gray eyes remained fixed on the small symbol beneath Eleanor's fingertips, a circle crossed by 3 narrow lines, while around them the strained dinner resumed in fragments of polite conversation. Silverware touched porcelain. Candle flames trembled in the draught. Somewhere near the far end of the table, Lady Beatrice laughed too brightly at something no one had found amusing. Eleanor lowered the linen again, hiding the carving from view. "My father marked certain entries with that symbol," she whispered. "Only the ones he would not explain to me." Alexander leaned slightly closer, his voice controlled. "And you are certain this table belonged to him?" "I used to bring him tea while he worked. It stood beneath the western window in the old estate office." She glanced toward Beatrice. "I have no idea why it is here now." Alexander followed her gaze. Beatrice immediately turned to address the gentleman beside her. The movement was small, almost meaningless, but Eleanor saw Alexander notice it. He noticed everything. When dinner finally ended, Lady Margaret excused herself with a tired smile, and the remaining guests drifted toward the drawing room. Eleanor expected Alexander to follow them. Instead, he spoke quietly to the butler. "Leave the lamps. Close the doors when the others have gone." Within minutes the great dining room fell silent. Rain tapped steadily against the windows, and the enormous portraits along the walls seemed to watch as Eleanor returned to the little table. Alexander stood across from her while she lifted the cloth and examined the underside more carefully. "There," she said. A thin seam ran through the wood, nearly invisible beneath the dark polish. She pressed along at once. Nothing happened. Again, a soft click broke the silence. A narrow panel dropped open beneath the tabletop. Eleanor stared. The hidden space was scarcely 2 inches deep and empty except for a folded scrap of yellowed paper. For a moment she could not reach for it. It felt strangely intimate, as though her father's hand had placed it there knowing she might someday find it. Alexander seemed to understand. You should open it. Eleanor removed the paper and carried it toward the nearest candle. 3 lines were written in faded ink. October 17th, 1878. $9,400. T.W. Alexander's expression changed so slightly another person might have missed it. Eleanor did not. You know those initials? His gaze remained on the paper. Thomas Whitmore. Who was he? Alexander was silent long enough that the rain seemed suddenly louder. My younger brother. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. No one had ever mentioned a brother. Where is he now? The answer came without emotion, which somehow made it heavier. Thomas died 10 years ago. Eleanor looked again at the date. This was written before he died. Yes. Alexander moved toward the fireplace, one hand resting against the mantel. Thomas spent his final year at Blackwood accusing our estate managers of hiding money. No one believed him. Did you? Eleanor asked. Alexander's eyes met hers across the candlelit room. No. The single word carried a decade of regret. Eleanor turned the paper carefully between her fingers. My father died under almost the same accusation. Alexander's expression hardened with thought. Missing money. 2 men disgraced. One hidden message connecting them. Eleanor felt the pieces beginning to move into place, though the picture remained buried in shadow. Your Grace, she said softly. What if neither of them was lying? Alexander looked toward the closed dining room doors, then back at the paper in her hand. Then someone at Blackwood has been protecting the truth for 10 years. The next morning, Eleanor found Alexander waiting outside the old estate office before the household had fully awakened. Pale light pressed through the tall windows of Blackwood Hall, and the silence of the western corridor made every small sound distinct. The ticking of a distant clock, the settling of old wood, the faint movement of servants preparing fires downstairs. Alexander held the scrap of paper they had discovered the night before, folded once between his fingers. There is something you should know before we begin, he said. Eleanor stopped beside the office door. His expression had the controlled stillness she had begun to recognize as the mask he wore when emotion threatened to show. Thomas did not simply accuse the estate managers of moving money, he continued. He accused someone inside this family of allowing it. Eleanor glanced toward the sleeping house. Did he name anyone? Not to me. Alexander opened the door. Dust stirred in the gray morning light. The office was smaller than Eleanor remembered, but the old writing desk still stood beneath the western window exactly where her father had kept it. She crossed the room slowly, feeling the past gather around her in quiet details. A faded ink stain on the floor, a brass hook where his coat had once hung, a shallow scratch across the desk made when she was 13 and had dropped a ledger while trying to help him. Alexander watched without interrupting. He never stole from this estate, Eleanor said at last. I know that does not prove anything. No, Alexander replied. But I am no longer certain the accusation proved anything either. They began with the ledgers from 1878. For more than an hour, the only voices in the room were theirs, low and measured, as they compared rental income, repairs, wages, and transfers between Blackwood properties. Eleanor noticed patterns Alexander overlooked because she knew the people behind the numbers. The Mill Creek families paid nearly $800 more that year, she said. But no additional acreage was leased. Alexander studied the entry. The increase was approved under general improvements. What improvements? Eleanor asked. There were none recorded. A second discrepancy appeared 20 pages later. Then a third. Individually, each amount seemed ordinary. Together, they formed something deliberate. Alexander pulled another ledger toward him. Someone divided the transfers so no single entry looked suspicious. Eleanor nodded. My father would have noticed eventually. Thomas did. The words came heavily. Eleanor looked at him. Alexander's gaze remained on the page, but his voice had changed. He came to me one evening, carrying a stack of documents. He told me money was disappearing and that your father believed the same. I thought Thomas was frightened because his own debts were becoming known. So you refused to read them. Alexander finally looked up. Yes. There was no defense in the answer. Only regret. Eleanor turned another page and found the symbol again, a circle crossed by 3 lines. Beneath it, her father's handwriting had faded almost to brown. Ask Thomas before signing anything further. Alexander read the sentence twice. His hand tightened against the edge of the desk. Eleanor said nothing. Sympathy offered too quickly could become another kind of insult. After a long silence, Alexander spoke. I spent 10 years believing my brother had disgraced this family. Eleanor closed the ledger gently. Perhaps someone needed you to believe exactly that. A floorboard creaked beyond the office door. Both turned. No one entered. Alexander rose and opened it, but the corridor was empty. On the floor, several feet away, lay a white handkerchief edged with black lace. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Lady Beatrice had carried one just like it at dinner. Alexander picked up the handkerchief without comment, but Eleanor saw the change in his face. The black lace was unmistakable. Lady Beatrice favored the same pattern at breakfast, at chapel, and during every formal dinner, always folded with exact precision beside her plate. Yet neither of them spoke her name. Not then. Alexander placed the handkerchief inside the top drawer of the old desk and closed it softly. If she was listening, she knows we found something. Eleanor looked toward the empty corridor. Then we should assume she will try to learn how much. Alexander met her gaze. And we should give her nothing. By afternoon, Blackwood Hall had returned to its polished routine, but Eleanor no longer trusted the calm. Sunlight broke through the winter clouds and stretched across the marble floors. Servants carried fresh flowers into the drawing room, and distant laughter drifted from Lady Margaret's sitting room. Everything appeared civilized. That was what made it dangerous. Eleanor spent the next several hours comparing tenant records with the old ledgers. Alexander joined her shortly after lunch, carrying documents from the family archive that had not been opened in years. Together, they found irregularities scattered across nearly a decade. A rent increase in Mill Creek with no corresponding change in acreage. Repairs charged twice to the same property. Transfers labeled household improvements that matched no construction records. Someone was careful, Eleanor said. Not careful enough. Alexander placed another ledger beside hers. You noticed what 3 estate managers missed. Eleanor shook her head. They saw numbers. My father taught me to see people. She pointed to a name. The Carsons paid almost $300 more than their original lease required. That amount would have mattered to them. Alexander frowned. I know the property. Do you know the family? The question was simple. It unsettled him. Eleanor immediately wondered if she had gone too far, but Alexander did not retreat behind his title. No, he admitted. She turned another page. My father did, for several moments. Only the scratching of Eleanor's pencil disturbed the room. Then Alexander said, Thomas knew them too. It was the first time Eleanor had heard him speak his brother's name without anger. The change was small, but she felt it. Near sunset, Alexander ordered the overcharged rents reviewed and corrected. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. You are doing it immediately? If they were wrong yesterday, they remain wrong today. Something warm and unexpected moved through her, not affection exactly, but respect beginning to answer respect. Later, as the room darkened and the first lamps were lit, Eleanor discovered a transfer signed by Charles Whitmore, Beatrice's late husband. The amount was $1,200. 2 pages later appeared another. Then another. Each entry had been approved shortly before Thomas left Blackwood. Eleanor placed the ledger between them. Your uncle handled these accounts. Alexander's expression became unreadable. Yes. And Beatrice would have had access to his papers. Before he could answer, the office door opened. Lady Beatrice stood there in a dark green dress, her smile perfectly composed. I wondered where you both had disappeared. Her gaze fell to the ledger, then returned to Eleanor. Still searching through old mistakes? Eleanor closed the book gently. Sometimes old mistakes explain present ones. Beatrice's smile did not move, but her eyes did. For one brief second, they shifted toward the locked drawer where Alexander had placed the handkerchief. Eleanor noticed. So did Alexander. And in that instant, suspicion became something far more dangerous. It became certainty. The certainty in Eleanor's eyes followed Lady Beatrice from the office long after the door had closed behind her. For several seconds, Neither Eleanor nor Alexander spoke. The late afternoon light had weakened to a pale gold across the old desk, illuminating the ledger that connected Charles Whitmore to the missing estate funds. Alexander finally placed one hand over the page. "We do not confront her yet." Eleanor nodded. "Not without proof she cannot explain away." He looked at her with quiet approval. "You are more cautious than most lawyers I know." Most lawyers did not grow up with a father who taught them that people become very inventive when money is involved. The faint humor disappeared from her voice as she looked again at Charles's signature. During the next 2 days, Lady Beatrice behaved as though nothing had changed. That was what unsettled Eleanor most. At breakfast, she asked whether Eleanor had slept well. At tea, she sent a plate of small cakes to the estate office. In the drawing room, before several visiting neighbors, she praised Eleanor's diligence with such sweetness that the compliment itself became an insult. "Miss Hayes has adapted remarkably well to Blackwood Hall," she said. "One would hardly guess she was accustomed to such modest surroundings." Eleanor set down her cup. A room is only impressive until one learns what people choose to hide inside it. The conversation stopped. Lady Beatrice's smile remained perfectly still. Alexander, standing near the fireplace, lowered his gaze for a moment, though Eleanor saw the shadow of amusement at the corner of his mouth. Beatrice saw it too. Her expression cooled. "Confidence is admirable in a young woman," she replied, "provided it is not mistaken for entitlement." Eleanor met her eyes. "I have never wanted anything that did not belong to me." The words carried farther than Eleanor intended. Alexander looked toward her. Beatrice did not answer. That evening, Eleanor found Alexander alone in the estate office comparing Charles's transfers with household expenses from the same years. Snow had begun falling beyond the western windows, softening the fields beneath a white veil. "You should consider leaving Blackwood until this is finished," Alexander said without looking up. Eleanor stopped beside the desk. "Do you want me to leave?" His eyes lifted immediately. "No." The answer came too quickly to be merely polite. Something passed between them, brief and quiet, before Eleanor looked down at the papers. "Then I will stay." Alexander leaned back. "My aunt is trying to make you uncomfortable." "She has succeeded." That surprised him. Eleanor continued before he could respond. "Courage does not mean something fails to hurt. It means the hurt does not decide what you do next." Alexander studied her with an expression she could not name. "Thomas would have liked you." Eleanor's voice softened. "My father must have trusted him." They returned to the accounts. Near 11 o'clock, Eleanor noticed the same notation repeated beside 3 transfers connected to Charles. 11:11. She frowned. "This is not an amount." Alexander came around the desk. "It is a time." Eleanor remembered something her father had once said while repairing an old pocket watch. "When time stops at Blackwood, look where time cannot reach." Before she could speak, a distant sound vanished from the corridor. Tick, 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 then silence. Alexander turned toward the door. The library clock. Eleanor felt a chill move through her. "What about it?" His face had gone strangely pale. "Thomas gave that clock to our father." Alexander looked toward the dark hallway. "And it stopped at 11:11 on the night Thomas left Blackwood 10 years ago." The silence from the library clock drew Eleanor and Alexander into the corridor before either of them spoke. Blackwood Hall had settled into the deep stillness of midnight, its lamps burning low against dark wood and stone while snow gathered beyond the tall windows. The clock stood at the far end of the library, 8 feet of walnut and brass, its hands frozen at 11:11. Alexander approached it slowly. "It has not stopped at that hour in 10 years." Eleanor remained beside him, her father's old words returning with unsettling clarity. "When time stops at Blackwood, look where time cannot reach." Alexander turned toward her. "He said that to you?" "Once. I thought he was being mysterious for his own amusement." Thomas enjoyed riddles. "Your father may have learned the habit from him." The remark carried the faintest warmth, but it disappeared when Alexander opened the clock case. The pendulum hung motionless. Behind it, Eleanor noticed a line in the wood that did not follow the grain. "There." Alexander pressed near the edge. A concealed panel released with a quiet click. Inside rested a single envelope, yellowed by age and sealed with faded wax. Thomas Whitmore was written across the front. Alexander did not reach for it immediately. Eleanor watched the certainty leave his face, replaced by something more fragile. For years, Thomas had existed only as regret, memory, and accusation. Now his handwriting stood inches away. "You should open it," Eleanor said softly. Alexander broke the seal. The letter was brief. Thomas wrote that he and Henry Hayes had traced missing estate funds through accounts overseen by Charles Whitmore. Transfers had been divided into smaller amounts and disguised as repairs, wages, and household expenses. Several records had disappeared after Henry questioned them. Near the bottom, one sentence had been underlined twice. "Beatrice knows where the final ledger is hidden." Alexander read it again. His hand lowered slowly. "He came to me with papers." Eleanor said nothing. "He asked me for 1 hour. I gave him 5 minutes." Alexander stared at the letter. "I told him that accusations without proof were an embarrassment to the family." Eleanor heard the bitterness beneath the calm. "And now you have proof." "Now I have his words 10 years too late." She stepped nearer, but did not offer comfort he had not asked for. "Then perhaps being late matters less than what you do after you arrive." Alexander looked at her. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face, and for one quiet moment he was not the Duke of Blackwood. He was simply a brother who had finally learned that the dead man he judged had been telling the truth. He handed Eleanor the letter. Their fingers touched briefly. Neither moved away at once. Then Eleanor lowered her eyes and read the final lines. Thomas had written that the missing ledger would remain somewhere Beatrice could access, but Charles could not, a place inside Blackwood Hall associated with family rather than business. "That could mean dozens of rooms," Eleanor whispered. Alexander looked around the library. "Or one room everyone considers too ordinary to search." A faint sound came from the corridor. A door closing. Alexander moved to the entrance and opened it. No one was there. On the narrow table beneath the portrait gallery rested a silver candle snuffer. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Lady Beatrice had carried it into chapel that morning. Alexander stared at the object, then back at Thomas's letter. "She knows." Eleanor folded the page carefully. "Then we find the ledger before she decides what to do about it." By breakfast, Eleanor understood that whoever had hidden the truth for 10 years had stopped relying on silence. Her room looked exactly as she had left it, yet a drawer stood open by less than an inch, and beneath a folded handkerchief rested Lady Margaret's emerald brooch. Eleanor stared at it without touching it. The jewel had not been misplaced. It had been planted. A knock sounded almost at once. Lady Beatrice entered before Eleanor could answer, followed by the housekeeper and 2 members of the family. "Forgive the intrusion," Beatrice said softly. "Lady Margaret cannot find something very dear to her." Eleanor looked at the brooch, then back at Beatrice. "How unfortunate." The housekeeper followed her gaze and gasped. Beatrice's expression settled into perfect disappointment. "Miss Hayes, surely there is an explanation." Eleanor felt every old humiliation return at once. The small table, the careful smiles, the implication that poverty and dishonor were neighbors. But she refused to let any of it bend her posture. "There is. Someone placed it there." Beatrice sighed. "That is a serious accusation. So is theft." Alexander's voice came from the doorway. The room fell silent. He entered slowly, his gaze moving from Eleanor to the brooch and then to his aunt. "Who found it?" "We all did," Beatrice answered. "In Miss Hayes's room." Eleanor turned to Alexander before he could speak. "Do not defend me because of my father." His expression tightened. "Eleanor, and do not defend me because you care what happens to me." No one in the room moved. "Defend me only if you believe I am innocent." Alexander held her gaze for a long moment. The Duke of Blackwood had spent years learning how to hide uncertainty, but Eleanor saw the instant when doubt gave way to conviction. He turned to the housekeeper. "Who entered this room today?" The woman hesitated. "2 maids, Your Grace." Lady Beatrice also came earlier with flowers. Beatrice stiffened. "Alexander, surely you are not suggesting that I placed my own mother's brooch here." "I am suggesting nothing yet." His voice was calm. "I am asking questions. At the expense of this family's dignity?" Alexander looked at her. "Dignity that depends on avoiding questions is not dignity." Beatrice's face hardened. Eleanor should have felt relieved. Instead, a quiet certainty settled over her. Even if Alexander cleared her name, Blackwood Hall would always make her innocence seem like something granted by someone above her. That evening, she packed her case. Alexander found her near the foot of the staircase, where pale snowlight stretched across the marble floor. "You are leaving." It was not a question. "Yes." If you go now, people will say you fled. Eleanor lifted her chin. People have been saying things about me my entire life. Eleanor, I can prove this. Then prove it. Her voice softened, though her resolve did not. But prove it because the truth matters. Not because you want me to stay. Alexander said nothing. She looked at him for one final moment. I will not remain in a house where my innocence survives only because a duke chooses to believe me. The words struck harder than anger would have. He had thought standing beside her was enough. He understood now that it was only the beginning. Eleanor carried her case toward the front doors. Alexander did not stop her. For once, protection meant letting her walk away while he remained behind to make the truth impossible to bury. 3 days after Eleanor left Blackwood Hall, Alexander summoned the entire family to dinner. No explanation accompanied the request, and no one mistook it for a social invitation. By 7 o'clock, every chair around the long mahogany table was occupied, while the smaller table near the wall remained where it had stood on the night Eleanor was first separated from the family. This time, however, no place-setting waited upon it. Alexander had covered its surface with evidence. The old estate ledgers lay beside Thomas's letter, Charles Whitmore's financial records, Lady Margaret's emerald brooch, and a final leather-bound account book Alexander had discovered that morning. Finding it had required more than luck. Thomas had written that the missing ledger was hidden somewhere Beatrice could reach, but Charles could not. Lady Margaret, after hours of reflection, remembered that Charles had never been permitted inside her private morning room, though Beatrice visited her there almost daily. Years after Charles died, an old writing cabinet from that room had been moved into Beatrice's sitting room. Alexander examined it himself and discovered a false wooden back behind the lower drawer. The ledger had been sealed inside. Lady Beatrice entered the dining room last. Her gaze fell upon the book, and for the first time Alexander saw fear reach her face before discipline concealed it. "This is unnecessarily dramatic," she said. Alexander remained standing. "No. Drama requires invention. Tonight requires only truth." Candlelight trembled over the pages as he opened the ledger. For more than 10 years, money was removed from Blackwood accounts under false descriptions. Repairs that were never made. Wages that were never paid. Household expenses that never existed. The sums were divided into amounts small enough to escape notice. Beatrice folded her hands. Charles managed hundreds of accounts. Mistakes were inevitable. These were not mistakes. Alexander turned several pages. Charles's signature appeared beside the transfers. Beneath them were notes written in Beatrice's hand. One sentence had been copied twice into the margin. Transfer the difference through household restoration. Henry must not see the revised account. Lady Margaret drew in a quiet breath. Beatrice's composure faltered. "You cannot prove I understood what Charles intended." Alexander placed Thomas's letter beside the ledger. "Then explain this." Another note in Beatrice's handwriting instructed Charles to remove the Western ledger because Thomas had spoken with Henry Hayes. Silence settled across the room. Alexander continued. "My brother discovered what was happening. Henry Hayes discovered it with him. Instead of being heard, both men were discredited." His voice remained controlled, but the next words cost him more. "Thomas came to me with proof. I refused to listen because accepting his accusation would have embarrassed this family." Beatrice rose. "And now you intend to disgrace us for the sake of a bookkeeper's daughter?" Alexander looked toward the empty chair beside him. "No, I intend to stop confusing silence with honor." He placed Lady Margaret's brooch beside the final ledger. "The housekeeper confirmed you entered Eleanor's room before this appeared there. I will not pretend that coincidence is innocence when the rest of the evidence shows motive." Beatrice said nothing. Alexander closed the book. "Every missing dollar will be restored. Every affected tenant account will be corrected. Henry Hayes's name will be cleared publicly. Thomas's findings will be entered into the family archive exactly as he wrote them." Lady Margaret lowered her eyes, grief and relief passing together across her face. Alexander looked toward the small table against the wall, then toward the empty chair Eleanor should have occupied. "She asked me to prove the truth because it was right, not because I wanted her to stay." His voice softened. "For once in my life, I intend to honor that request." Outside, snow drifted quietly across the Virginia grounds. Inside Blackwood Hall, the family name remained intact, but its meaning had changed forever. Spring came slowly to Blackwood Hall. The last snow withdrew from the Virginia fields in silver ribbons, leaving dark soil beneath the first pale green of new leaves. Eleanor learned of the changes through letters that asked nothing from her. The first confirmed that Henry Hayes had been publicly cleared of every accusation connected to the missing estate funds. The second explained that each tenant family affected by the altered accounts had been repaid in full. The third came from Lady Margaret, who wrote that Thomas Whitmore's records had been restored to the family archive exactly as he had left them, without softened language or convenient omissions. No letter came from Alexander. Eleanor understood that silence better than any plea. He had finally learned that truth could not be offered as payment for affection. 6 weeks after leaving Blackwood Hall, Eleanor hired a carriage and returned. The house appeared beyond the budding trees beneath a clear afternoon sky, its gray stones softened by spring light. Alexander stood at the entrance when the carriage stopped. He descended several steps, then waited. He did not rush toward her. He did not reach for her case. The choice of crossing the remaining distance belonged entirely to Eleanor. She stepped down and walked toward him. "Miss Hayes." His voice was composed, though his eyes betrayed surprise. "Your Grace. I did not expect you. I know." A faint smile touched his face. They entered together. Eleanor noticed changes immediately. A notice in the western corridor listed corrected tenant rents. Henry Hayes's name had been restored to the estate records beside a formal statement acknowledging that his warnings had been ignored. Thomas's papers occupied their own place in the archive. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been rewritten to protect the Whitmore name. Alexander eventually led her into the dining room. Afternoon sunlight lay across the long mahogany table, and near the wall stood the smaller table where Eleanor had once been seated apart from everyone else. Her father's carved symbol remained beneath its edge. "You kept it," she said. "I did." "Why?" Alexander rested his hand lightly on the wood. "Because removing it would have been easier than remembering what it taught me." Eleanor looked toward the place where she had once sat alone. "And what did it teach you?" "That rank can decide where a chair is placed." His gaze met hers. "It cannot decide where honor belongs." She turned toward the main table. Beside Alexander's place stood an empty chair. There was no name card upon it. He made no movement to pull it out. "Lady Margaret told me Beatrice left Virginia." Alexander nodded. "She is staying with relatives in Richmond. The estate records will remain unchanged." There was no triumph in his voice, only finality. Eleanor appreciated that. "And you?" she asked. "What changed for you?" Alexander considered the question. "I stopped believing that protecting a family name and protecting a family's honor were the same thing." Silence settled gently between them. "I owe you an apology," he continued, "for thinking that standing beside you once was enough." Eleanor shook her head. "You owed my father the truth. You owed Thomas the truth. You owed the tenants the truth." She looked at the empty chair. "You gave them that. And what do I owe you?" "Nothing." The answer surprised him. Eleanor crossed the room, placed her hand upon the chair, and pulled it out herself. "That is why whatever happens next can be my choice." She sat. Alexander remained standing for one quiet moment before taking the chair beside her. Eleanor glanced toward the smaller table, then back at him. "I did not return because your family finally decided where I belong." His voice softened. "Then why did you return?" Eleanor smiled, small and certain. "Because I decided where I wished to be." Outside, spring light moved across fields once buried beneath winter. Inside Blackwood Hall, no title placed one heart above another. For true nobility had never been measured by the chair a person was given, but by the courage to rise when another person's dignity had been pushed aside.